Hey, Matt, want to share who is on your panel and we'll get started.
You bet. Thank you, Gigi. Many ways, thank you. I'm Mathew Cowell. I'm here with Mollie Norris from Majestic Collaborations in Denver, Colorado. We have Amy and Mollie, Quinlan-Hayes, Amy Schwartzman, who are a couple of luminaries. We were really glad to help get in this conversation. We'll mostly be hosting and letting them talk about some of the work they've done over the last many years. Prior to beginning, I would like to having learned in Canada about the native land recognition, I think it's still important to do that even in this time when we're isolated and in our homes, and remembering that all resilience really does come from the planet we live on, and forgetting about that can be easy. So this is something, if you're interested in the culture, or the Department of Arts and Culture has a really good way to work out how to make up this on your own and speak from your heart. Any discussion about resilience should start at the ground up. My family has lived in what's now called Colorado for 5 generations, and our sons are the 6th, but we're not natives. This land has been the historical homeland of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho, as well as other tribes who convened regularly at the confluence of the 2 rivers here in Denver, known as the Platte and Cherry Creek now, for many generations beyond that can be counted. As settlers, it's upon us to recognize that colonialism is in the roots of violence and inequity that we struggle with today. The ceremony of settlers tends to be towards family and culture, which is transportable, and less so about the land. This native land recognition is important in that we recognize that estimated 80 to 95% of North Americans on this continent were wiped out by diseases. So out of respect for elders, we've decided to isolate, and for the vulnerable among us. Increasingly, we know that we're all vulnerable. I hope we all feel some resonance towards this planet on our health walks, and remember some of that. So that's how I'll begin this, and I'm happy to let Mollie introduce herself, and then we want to let you know who's on this panel that we're lucky enough to have with us.
Thanks. My name is Mollie Norris. I come at this from a little bit different angle. I have spent many years as a transportation planner, transportation advocate, and most recently as a transportation engineer. And so a lot of the resilience work that my framework that I come at resilience at is really through a frame of how people move around, how we transport, and how transportation is one of the main elements of how we create space. But a lot of my graduate work really incorporated a lot of community resilience work, and being in relationship with the musician, and really, appreciating a lot of music and art. A lot of my newer work has really been focused on how artists can be an essential part of community resilience. So I'm excited to help host this panel, and we want to hear now from Mollie and Amy. How about Amy? Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Amy Schwartzman. I was a dancer for years, and I also worked in theater, and then I was an arts administrator. And my first introduction to working in the area of arts and emergency management was actually after 9/11. I had been working prior to then as the executive director of Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, and then I was at the point where I wasn't working and working independently. 9/11 hit us, and I was asked by the New York City Arts Coalition to actually put together some guidebooks to talk about how artists and arts organizations and all nonprofits could approach the relief landscape that had arisen at that time. After that time, I became the information officer for that fund, and over the next almost 20 years, on and off, I've been a consultant in this area. I've worked with the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, the Performing Arts Readiness Project. I've worked for FEMA after Sandy as a community planner, helping with the recovery of artists and arts organizations. I worked in Maria. I was hired by the RAND Corporation to help them put together what kind of recovery strategies we should use for artists and arts organizations on behalf of our government. And so I've been doing this work in many ways over the years and have written various things, and we'll talk about some of those resources, I think, in a little while. But I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to work with all of you and present to the rest of you who are listening to us.
Miss Mollie Quinlan-Hayes. We have 2 Mollies, Mollie with an IE.
Great, thank you, Matt. Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Mollie Quinlan-Hayes. I'm a freelance arts administrator based in Atlanta, Georgia. And my most recent work has been with two arts services and funding organizations, South Arts, a regional organization, and prior to that, as Deputy Director of the Arizona Commission on the Arts. So I landed in Atlanta almost 6 months to the day after Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And was immediately brought into a conversation with our board about resilience and recovery in our region that ultimately became what is now the national initiative known as Arts Ready that I direct. And we look at helping particularly arts organizations to prepare for any type of crisis that might hit them. artsready.org, if you would like to get more information. As we talk today, I think we'll make clear that preparedness and planning are part of a continuum. And then when you go through a crisis, big or small, you learn, you adapt, and then that feeds into your next evolution, hopefully, towards being even more resilient and more prepared. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next half hour with you.
There it is. Thank you for that, ladies. Just so all the attendees know, we will be sharing our email addresses at the end of the presentation, so you can keep learning more from these experts. Let's hear quick from you about your introduction as well.
My name's Mathew Cowell, and I work at Majestic Collaborations. A lot of those Denver folks that are in there are close associates here. We've been working with Denver Arts and Venues, embedded as an emergency preparedness consultant for about 2 years, and that's paid for by the Performing Arts Readiness Group. It's a national group that has done some great work and webinars that are all free. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation. After Hurricane Sandy, they formed to help arts organizations look at their emergency planning, and that's where I met Mollie and Amy. Lisa Gidgoddess has been a mentor here, and Tom Clareson, and I've learned a lot from the people who are coming up as well. I really love Don Pitts and Michael Bracey, and Storm has an incredible student body here at the University of Colorado. Those students have been learning music business, but also this whole Music Cities business about cultural placekeeping and creative economies. And there's an amazing group of people I've come to know and introduced to Gigi at the airport in Austin after South by Southwest last year, and saw and could tell that she was a luminary, not just from her great earrings, but from her great mind. And so really honored and humbled to be here today. There's a lot of great work that has been done in the past by some organizations that help us not have to reinvent the wheel about everything. We're going to talk about ways COVID is quite different than anything we've seen before, but there's also ways that disaster organization has happened in the past. And myself as a, primarily musician, but also in the last several years, I've produced 120 festivals and learned a lot about how to gather people. The Art of Mass Gatherings is a classroom that we've developed to help share emergency preparedness in an experiential learning environment, to help people get out of their agencies and out of their silos and to learn on their feet. Let's talk a little bit about this great work. Mollie's going to get Amy queued up here by gushing on you for a moment about something really cool.
Well, one of the kind of essential documents that I really reviewed a lot in my graduate studies about the community resilience work was the Cultural Placekeeping Guide that Amy had, was the author of and had a big hand in that effort. So we want to hear about that as you answer this next question. But before we get too far into this panel, it's going to go really fast. Amy, if you want to take a quick effort at telling us helping us to define resilience as we start this conversation about resilience in our communities. Let's define it so that we are all on the same page talking about it and how it might impact different communities differently.
So when I think of resilience, I have the image actually. Picture yourself maybe being a martial arts artist. And I think about it being a Tai Chi artist, because in fact, resilience is the ability to recover from the blows and things that might hit you. So you need to be grounded. You need to be flexible. You need to have balance. You need to be going inward and outward. And when I say, think of it not as the fighting master, but the Tai Chi master, who really you are taking what comes at you and how do you incorporate it? How do you move it back? How do you flow with it and recover from it? And it takes all kinds of aspects. It's on the individual level. It's on the organizational level. It's on the social level, and it's on the societal level. It's not just about you, because it's also very much about the society around you, and it's all of these dimensions working together. And within each of them, it's about social and emotional. It's about psychological. It's about physical. It's about economic and financial. And it's really about figuring out how all those things work together. And one very important thing I want to say, which I think we all need to think about as a sort of framework, is I think the idea of resilience gets us sometimes to sort of focus on ourselves, right? It's about me. It's about how I cope with this. And some of that's about who you are and how you're made up and the skills that you can learn. But this slide is going to show you something, right? Equality and equity are not the same thing. We all stand in a different place. And I think there's kind of a myth or a narrative about resilience that I want to counteract, which is that because it's telling us you can be resilient, focus on yourself and how you relate to these other dimensions, the truth of the matter is that our society is probably not really very resilient, at least here in the US. There may be other places where that's more true, because we are not a society of equity. We all stand in a different place, and if anything, COVID-19 has shown us that those folks who are in vulnerable positions, communities of color, Native American communities, the elderly, artists are often a vulnerable class, that people in these positions are being disproportionately impacted by this crisis. And that's because we're not all starting in the same place. I have a friend who many years once said, when we talked about the idea of recovery, which resilience is very much related to, she said, when you come to my community, and that community was the Bronx, New York, and you say recovery is about getting back to where you were, if where you were wasn't good to start, how is that about recovery? So I want us to really think about that when we think about resilience, because it's a really important overriding concept, to not let that myth throw us back on ourselves, because we need to work together to make change. So I think we may talk a little bit about the role of advocacy, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thanks.
So Mollie, you've worked with institutions and agencies through several disasters and crises. What would you say remains the same about emergency planning, and what do you see as different in disasters and crises, and what do you see as different in this COVID situation?
Yeah, well, I think that as I talk to organizations about readiness planning, we talk about all hazards planning, which means that you need to have a plan for what to do no matter what type of crisis hits you. If your upcoming engagement is canceled because there was a flood in the community, or because the center that was going to present you closed, doesn't matter. You've lost that connection. So thinking about what is going to be your plan B. I think the challenge here is that often a crisis, whether it's a small one or a community-wide one, and now a worldwide one, I'm sorry, just lost my train of thought. When you're looking at a crisis like normal, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, whether it's something very quick like a tornado or something that is forecast, such as a hurricane. But this, we are in the middle of it and we do not know when it's going to end, and it's not visible to us. So I think there are a lot of things that make this scary, but I think that there are also some things that we can think about doing for ourselves and our organizations and our communities that can take away some of that fear and give us a little bit more control of not the external environment, but certainly how we respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question is for both of you. You're going to have to Rochambeau to see who goes first. And who wants to take which part? There's a lot of ways that artists can really be active participants in resilience in our communities. In particular, you two are experts in how they can do that post-disaster, post-emergency. So this is kind of a two-part question. Each take one or both address both. But the first question is, how can creatives and artists and musicians in our communities respond? And the other is, while those creatives can often be resourced to participate in that response, how is it that creative communities are affected differently after a response? Yeah, how are individuals affected differently?
So I'm going to say one thing. I think that one of the amazing things about musicians, artists in all disciplines, whenever there have been disasters, and I think we've already all been seeing it now, people really jump in. They want to help their community recover. The role of the arts in community recovery is huge. I think where we have a strange and new and interesting dimension here, of course, is that we're living in this virtual world now. And so presenting in that virtual space is a little bit different. I mean, if you're in a musical group, if you're not a solo musician and you don't live with the musicians with whom you perform regularly, there's the challenge of how we do this. And I've actually seen various things on Facebook of kids from the New England Conservatory, I think it was, getting together and performing something. So people are doing it, but certainly there are challenges. I think the thing with creatives in terms of resilience also is that because what we do in a community is that we are creative, it enables us to see many different ways and how to behave. I think that the real challenge now is that people are struggling with this idea of, how can I monetize this? If I've lost my ability to earn an income, how can I work in this virtual environment to in terms of monetization of that? So I've lost income. And one thing I will say, just because I really want to get it in, and then I'll turn it over to Mollie for this, is that remember, you're not in this by yourself. The government is providing programs now. There is the Disaster Unemployment Assistance Program in the US. In Europe, there are countries covering 80% of whatever people's needs are. Artists have a tendency to downplay and say, because they're creative, I can do it myself and I can take care of it. This is for you, and it's also for everyone, that they understand how many creative workers there are out there who have needs. And as Mollie said, this is going to be a long time. So, if you can totally take care of yourself for the next 6 months to a year, okay. But if not, keep abreast of what's happening and make sure that you do register, because you deserve all this.
Right. And there have been people advocating on your behalf for a long time to make sure that individual artists and creatives are included in the CARES Act. So you should all know that. I wanted to add to that to say that when I think about resilience, particularly in the current environment, that we need to think about part of being resilient is being relevant, right? It is looking outside and figuring out, how do I work in perhaps new and different ways? How can art be powerful in this pandemic? Amy has noted a couple of examples. We are looking at both organizations and individuals. How do you connect? You might have to be a lot more porous than you normally are, because addressing these big challenges that we're going through are not likely to use the skill sets that you have individually. So connecting with other people is important. And I wanted to bring up an example of how that pivoting to a place of relevancy is being done by one particular organization. And it's set up to benefit the artists as well. And Matt, I don't know if we're able to bring up those slides real quickly, from the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. And they have great experience working in and with community in other disasters, including hurricanes and most recently the floods of several years ago. And have created a program called Creative Relief. And just looking at what they put together in the last 3 weeks or so is pretty remarkable. And they have 3 programs that have different levels of investment. Are we able to see those, Matt? Or
I might just put it in there.
Okay. I'll just describe them briefly.
Advanced zooming.
But basically, it's from the simple, for 10 minutes, you can take a template of an artist-designed heart and decorate it, post it in a window so that it's publicly visible, and also post it online with a hashtag, Hearts from Home, to honor healthcare workers. Mm-hmm. The next thing is a little bit more in-depth, but they have brought together textile artists as sewers, and you can either, you can invest and help to underwrite their sewing of protective gowns for healthcare workers. So that's a combination serving the healthcare workers' needs and employing artists.
Where is it?
And then on the final is more in depth, and they are literally engaging local musicians to perform music at virtual happy hours for a company. So a company can, for $150, bring a music group out social distancing from their employees, and they'll have a private performance. So this idea of, being porous, being permeable, looking out and saying, where can I step in? Where is help needed? And also, how can we combine resources people want to give and artists want to work? So I think there's some really nice melding there. Thank you, Matt.
Of course. So where do we go from here? And we've got a few more minutes. I think here's, I guess, making it a little heavy for a moment. If we look at this, I think that we've got an issue. This one doesn't totally tell the story, because it's like the divers getting attacked by COVID-19, economics and the climate change, but the divers kind of created a lot of these issues, too. But as we look forward to these other issues that are coming up, I think a lot of these performing arts readiness and South Arts and the National Coalition for Arts Readiness and Preparedness, these are where we're all sort of building muscles to think about how are artists going to be a part of this sort of response. And I lately been thinking about it. My mother teaches learning styles and curriculum development, and she says, you're onto a really good curriculum when you come up with questions that are enduring, that are not easy to answer, that you can talk to your smartest and greatest friends about, and you're going to all keep adding parts of it for a long time. And lately, where I've landed on for these enduring questions that Mollie and I and our collaborators lately have been jamming on, is how can disaster and emergency response bend towards more creative solutions and break some of and get rid of some blind spots? And then how can creatives start bending more into being prepared to be disaster thinkers, because they're good at thinking, and then also doers, and how are they going to be creating some livelihood out of being in that place, and looking forward to those other sharks. Those are a big deal to think about. How can we not be the first ones who are crushed? I mean, these are and need assistance, but are also building some of those skills to be able to be helping. I think that there's a few places we've seen some bright spots we wanted to share with y'all. That with the one at the hospital that I heard you talking about, Mollie, yesterday. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were seeing for people in a sort of traumatic place there?
Sure. So I'm somewhat familiar with the work that is going on at Houston Methodist Hospital System, and the fact that they do a lot of work with not only patients, as we all know, all the research about how arts experiences can help patients, but also in with medical practitioners, and particularly in Houston after Harvey with the first responders. And there are two things that I keep thinking about in this moment. One is, I wish every single corporation would hire an artist to help them develop their plan, because those creative thoughts are what are necessary. And the other is that there is going to be a huge, when this is over, this huge amount of PTSD among our first responders and our healthcare workers. And how can we as a community be ready to help with their recovery, because we know how powerful the arts and music can be in that. So thinking about how in the ramp up to reopening, those of us on the kind of policy and structural side can be creating methods for people to receive training and be supported in helping to assist with some of that trauma after at least this wave has passed.
And you wanted to, thank you. And you wanted to point some folks to the Americans for the Arts survey, Amy. I just put that in the chat. If you guys look in the chat, there's several things that have come up while we're talking apropos to the discussion. So don't forget to check the chat.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. I mean, we've already alluded to the fact how being in community and working together makes a difference, and we're building community today doing that. But we want to direct you to some resources that you can actually participate in and make a difference with. I talked about the idea of we need to do advocacy. And the organizations like the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response is engaged in doing that and putting out things like the Cultural Placekeeping Guide. And that one is a resource for you. A group of artists could use it. A group of arts organizations can use it. It's to help people build networks to support them before, during, and after disasters. You create your own communications and coordination network, and you use it, and it's really a step-by-step guide. And it's also about building out to the emergency system so that you learn how to interact with them and work with them. The surveys that Americans for the Arts is doing are really, really important. There is one for individual artists in all disciplines, and there's one for arts organizations, whether they're for-profits, not-for-profits, or government organizations. And it's about the impact of COVID-19 on you. I really urge you all to go there, complete those, because the knowledge that you give us in this community that works on the policy level is going to be taken and be used to make arguments to the government, whether at the state, local, or federal levels, about changes that needs to happen. And there are changes that are going to need to happen. So that helps us. And then there's one other survey up there, which is also really important and relates to what we're talking about. They are collaborating with University College of London. There's a researcher that is doing work on the impact of self-isolation on mental health and the ability to be resilient. And anyone who's 18 or over can complete this. There's a link to that. And it's also going to be looking at, in future little surveys they'll be sending out, the impact of music and other arts on the ability to be resilient. So you can participate in the first one. If you decide you don't want to continue, you don't have to. But in being in community and sharing information, what we are doing is really building a better world for all of us and helping those out there in the larger society to really understand what our needs are.
Wow. Well, thank you, Amy and Mollie, so much for the work you've been doing in these decades. Again, that Cultural Placekeeping Guide is wonderful. Check it out. It takes a minute to download because it's dense, but it really talks about how you build a response as a community and as artists to do collective decision-making, triaging, deciding what kind of is going to take priority. These are the sort of things that if we see cities being changed by climate change, the stuff that we're talking about now will become a lot less about staying at home, and it'll become a lot more about how do you move a culture from one place to another. So we have a lot of work to do. Check out Performing Arts Readiness. That's the group we work with. It's a nonprofit that has a lot of new grants over the next 3 years. 40 grants for $7,000 each for organizations to do emergency planning for their organizations. Really love to see more people taking that up and forming networks, and artists becoming resilience workers. So Art of Mass Gatherings is where we'll be talking about this next. Gigi, Storm, thank you so much. Don Pitts, Michael Bracey coming up, wonderful thinkers. Put some earplugs in so you can still hear, but so your brain doesn't come out because they're so darn smart, it's going to get you. We really care about them. They've got great hearts and have been doing this work a long time. Thank you very much.